Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, today I want to talk about uh, what we know at this point about the origins of the COVID pandemic. Um, there's basically two claims that have been made about where the COVID virus uh, entered the human population and initiated the pandemic. Uh, as you probably know, a large proportion of the early cases of COVID were uh, associated with uh, wet markets, you know, markets where uh, live animals are sold to the public in Wuhan, China, and especially the Huanan seafood market. Um, and so of course, one theory about where the COVID pandemic came from is that, like other pandemics in the past, basically every pandemic and almost every academic or epidemic or major outbreak of an infectious disease, um, when uh, there were the first cases of those diseases, they were traced back to uh, uh, a jump from some animal species, zoonotic origin, in other words. Um, the other claim that's been made about where COVID came from is that, well, there happens to be a virology lab in Wuhan, China, that does research on coronaviruses, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Um, and the claim is that either accidentally or deliberately, that lab leaked the coronavirus, like either you know, there was a deliberate leak or uh, some worker at the lab got infected and spread it out into the community. Um, Now, what I want to do today is, first of all, talk about just some of the claims that have been made with regard to the lab leak theory and how that kind of became a popular claim, even though, in fact, at this point, 2.5 years after the pandemic originated, there's not really any solid evidence that that happened. Um, and I want to talk about two recent studies published in uh, the journal Science, the peer-reviewed journal Science, that shed light on the origins of the virus and specifically suggest that it indeed appears to have originated in the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. And I'll talk about some of the other research that's been done both on the origins of COVID and the origins of past uh, viruses that have led to epidemics such as SARS in 2002, 2003. Um, so there's a picture of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and this is from an article by Max Blumenthal and Ajit Singh of The Gray Zone, um, titled How a Trump Media Dump Mainstreamed Theory That Chinese Lab Manufactured Coronavirus. And basically, the point that they make is that people like Mike Pompeo and Brett Baer at Fox News and the Washington Times, a right-wing newspaper in Washington D.C., and others basically pushed the lab leak idea as kind of a political ploy to blame China for the pandemic. And you know, especially as the Trump administration popularized it later on, it was really kind of a way of avoiding taking responsibility for the fact that COVID was spreading like wildfire in the U.S., whereas ironically it wasn't doing so in China. They did a very good job, even though they didn't succeed in keeping it within the country. They did a very good job of containing COVID within China, so that even though it's a country of 1.4 billion people, only a few thousand people died in that outbreak, and really since then, not very many people have died. Now, I have to say, you know, assuming that it is zoonotic origin and originated in wet markets like the Huanan seafood market, rather than in a lab. Um, it is China's fault that they haven't done a better job of regulating their wet markets. They have laws on the books that are supposed to prohibit um, uh, vendors from selling wildlife in their markets, particularly wildlife that can uh, transmit infectious diseases, like um, raccoon dogs and civets and other animals that are known to be carriers of coronaviruses. Um, but I mean, even if it is China's fault that they didn't regulate their wet markets better, or even if I mean, we in science you can't you 100% prove something. It's not like geometry. So we have to say, even though at this point there's little to no evidence for it, we can't say with 100% certainty that there wasn't a lab leak. But even if it's that, it's still not China's fault that the West did a piss poor job of containing COVID. Um, that's Western government's fault. But they sure as heck tried to make it out to be China's fault, and they're still doing that. But Blumenthal and Singh go on to basically go through some of the history of the promotion of this idea that this conspiracy theory, because it's a theory that it leaked from the lab, and then there was a concerted effort to cover it up involving very large numbers of people. Um, that this theory was promoted by sources like the Washington Times, as I mentioned, Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump, Fox News, um, and so on. Um, and even though some of the people promoting this theory, acknowledged that we don't know whether, in fact, COVID originated in the Wuhan lab. They're just constantly implying that this is the case. Um, Now, for a long time, uh, it was a case that this was a theory promoted by Republicans and their supporters, Trump and Pompeo and you know, Josh Rogan of the Washington Post and so on and so forth. But eventually, of course, Trump lost the election, and there was you know, no longer an incentive to just kind of bash Trump for everything. Um, and given that uh, basically U.S. propaganda is constantly aimed at bashing other countries that the U.S. is geopolitical rivals with, such as China and Russia, um, you know, it's not surprising that eventually the Biden administration also and its supporters also started pushing the lab leak theory. Uh, Now you might wonder, well, why is you know promoting a lab leak theory more bashing China than saying, well, they didn't do a good job of regulating their wet markets? Okay, well, basically, The thing is, China has been saying, Chinese government and Chinese scientists, have been saying all along, look, this didn't come from a lab. We have a lot of reason to think it originated in the Huanan market. Uh, so, if you're saying that it came from a lab leak, you're saying that the Chinese government and Chinese scientists are lying. They're covering something up. Um, so, so it is China bashing in a way that saying it originated uh, because you know uh, vendors in the Huanan markets sold animals that were contaminated with viruses illegally, and the Chinese government didn't stop it. Okay, yeah, that's a problem that's happening, and it's been happening for a long time. We know beyond any reasonable doubt that the SARS pandemic back in the early 2000s originated in animal markets in southeastern China. Um, but in any case, um, Joshua Cho did a nice job in an article published last year of summarizing reasons why um, scientists lean very strongly toward the idea that uh, SARS-CoV-2 uh, entered the human population through um, you know, animal markets in Wuhan, and the fact that the location of this virology lab is in Wuhan isn't by itself evidence of anything. Particularly since it's nowhere near where the majority of early cases of the disease happen. Uh, so, so Joshua starts out talking about how in 2020, uh, U.S. officials like Senator Tom Cotton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and people who are probably on the CIA payroll, defectors from China. And there were also a lot of reports at the time disputing and dismissing such claims. Basically, the Democratic leaning wing of the political establishment in 2020 strongly rejected the lab leak theory because it was associated with Trump. Um, but that started to change, as I think I mentioned earlier, in 2021 when Biden had become the president. So there were all these Western media outlets claiming that supposedly the theory that they had dismissed the year before was suddenly now credible. So Washington Post, Timeline, how the Wuhan lab leak theory suddenly became credible. New Yorker, the sudden rise of the coronavirus lab leak theory. New York, the groupthink that produced the lab leak failure should scare liberals. So they're claiming that groupthink led to people dismissing the lab leak theory. Now, although it may be true that there was groupthink going on, uh, you know, uh, that played a role in people dismissing it out of hand because it was associated with Trump, and liberals hated Trump and so forth. Of course, that doesn't mean that there weren't sound reasons why people thought it originated in animal markets. Um, and Cho goes on to say, despite the sudden media enthusiasm for the lab leak theory, there remains as little compelling evidence that the virus escaped from a Chinese lab as there always has been. NPR claims that the shift in coverage was due to a group of scientists publishing a statement arguing that the lab leak theory needs to be investigated, even if it may not be likely, and more tellingly, simply because President Biden said, look, let's investigate this. But, I mean, that statement published by this group of scientists, isn't saying, again, that a lab leak is the likely origin of COVID. They said it's not the most likely origin of it, but that we need to keep an open mind and investigate everything. But that then gets twisted in a lot of the corporate media into the idea that lots of scientists find the lab leak theory credible. So they're implying that the lab leak theory should be taken seriously, because now Joe Biden's promoting it and not Donald Trump. And hey, these scientists said we shouldn't rule it out. Um, but again, we shouldn't base our judgment of how likely something is to be true on just on who's saying it. We should look at the evidence. Some of the signatories of that letter have you know, emphasized that that doesn't mean just because their letter said that we should investigate all possibilities that they endorse the lab leak theory, and in fact, it doesn't even mean that they think it's likely at all. Um, they're basically just saying, look, World Health Organization, uh, you know, put more time into determining the origin of COVID, whatever it might be. Um, One thing that had a lot to do with the lab leak theory gaining more credence among the more liberal wing of the uh, political establishment in the United States, the corporate media and politicians, is that the Wall Street Journal published a report um, that cited anonymous, quote, current and former officials claiming that 3 researchers from China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick enough in November 2019 that they sought hospital care, with symptoms consistent with both COVID-19 and common seasonal illnesses, which, um, you know, that I mean, the report, which was issued by the Trump administration on its way out, it was issued by the State Department, where Mike Pompeo is Secretary of State. They don't say who these officials were. They don't really. I mean, there's no evidence that 3 researchers, even if they were sick, that that they had COVID. And one thing that often doesn't uh, you know, I guess isn't known or is you know, deliberately not talked about, I'm not sure, is that in China, often people get routine medical care at hospitals, even if they're not uh, ill to a significant extent. Um, and November 2019 not only was when the first documented cases of COVID happened, but it was also in the middle of flu season, and there were lots of cases of flu in Wuhan and other parts of China. Um, and this piece in the Wall Street Journal, interestingly enough, I told you I'd get back to him, was co-authored. His lead author was Michael Gordon, who was the co-author, along with Judith Miller, of that infamous New York Times report that I talked about. Um, Here it is, September 8th, 2002. Threats and responses. The Iraqis, USS Hussein intensifies quest for A-bomb parts. Um, so, this one article more than anything else that was published in the um, U.S. media at the time, uh, you know, went a long ways toward promoting the idea that Iraq either had or was acquiring quote unquote weapons of mass destruction. And this claim just got repeated over and over without any evidence until not very long afterwards, the majority of the public believed it, along with believing, because it was implied over and over, that Saddam Hussein had some connection with Al Qaeda, that he was collaborating with them, when in fact Iraq was, albeit an authoritarian government, it was a secular government which had no connection with religious fundamentalists. Um, But so yeah, unnamed intelligence officials, not scientists who state their name and go on the record, but unnamed intelligence officials claim that 3 people from uh, Wuhan Institute of Virology with ill-defined symptoms visiting a hospital for outpatient treatment must be evidence of of lab workers getting infected with COVID. Now, in fact, the Wuhan Institute of Virology tested all of their employees for antibodies for COVID-19 back in 2020. I didn't find any. I'm sure probably since then, maybe somebody, well, I don't know about probably even because China did such a good job of containing it, but yeah, there's a distinct possibility that some people who worked at the Wuhan Institute of Virology got COVID. But, at least I think it was in January of 2020 when they tested people for antibodies. Nobody in the lab, appeared to have any. Now you could say, "Oh, they're just lying. They're covering it up." Blah blah blah. But you're just pushing a conspiracy theory if you say that. You're not promoting any, evidence of anything. And if you want to be a conspiracy theorist and assume that Chinese scientists must be lying about workers in the Wuhan Institute of Virology not being infected with, not having been infected with COVID during the early stages of the pandemic, well, if you want to be a conspiracy theorist and assume that, well, that's your thing to be a China basher, but, it's not mine. Um, and the virologist who uh, sort of runs the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Dr. Shi Jingli, who played a key role in establishing the origins of the first coronavirus that led to a pandemic, SARS. She's challenged intelligence agencies to say who these people are. The 3 researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology who they claim got sick. Okay, you say that's true. Who are they? And to date, nobody has come forward with any evidence that there actually were 3 people from the virology lab who went to the hospital for treatment for a respiratory illness. I mean, certainly that it's possible, but okay. If you don't have any evidence, if you can't say who they were or what they had, then this is not evidence of a damn thing. It's just not. But Western media outlets kind of took this claim at face value. And one thing that is important to bear in mind is that when scientists say something is possible, we can't rule it out. that doesn't mean that they think it's likely. Um, so, take the so-called debate about climate change, for example, where I don't know what it is, something like 98% of scientists with relevant expertise polled say humans are causing climate change through chopping down forests and greenhouse gas emissions and so on and so forth. Um, and very problematically, media coverage of climate change has at times, maybe not so much anymore, but certainly in the past, they've kind of uh, did this false equivalency where they would have debates between people who said, nah, climate change isn't real, who usually were connected with in some way with the fossil fuel industry, and people who said, yeah, climate change is definitely human caused. And, um, you know, uh, there's an overwhelming consensus that climate change is being caused by human activities. And similarly, at this point in time, there's this pretty strong consensus of scientists who have relevant expertise about COVID and its origins that um, zoonotic origin is a lot more likely than a lab leak origin. Um, you know, because, I mean, again, technically science is inductive reasoning, and you don't prove stuff, so we can't say, there's no possibility that there was a lab leak. But, you know, look at the evidence. What does the evidence say? The evidence doesn't support a lab leak at this point. So, another uh, thing that promoted the lab leak theory was an article by Nicholas Wade, who's a science reporter. Let's see, where. And I think it was in the New York Times where he first published an article purporting to have found evidence of, you know, uh, coronavirus having been genetically engineered, etc. In short, he was pushing the lab leak theory. Um, let's see. I believe yeah. Here we go. Where was it? Oh, the New York Times. I believe he published an article, claiming that yeah, he had all this evidence consistent with a lab leak theory, and he passes himself off as some sort of expert. In fact, he just has a Bachelor of Science degree in biology. He's not a scientist. He's just a journalist, and he actually, um, as it turns out, in the past has made pseudoscientific racist claims. Um, let's see, where is? Oh, here we go. Uh, in 2014, Nicholas Wade published a book pushing racist pseudoscience. He argued in that book that there was a genetic basis for differences in intelligence between races. And you might say, what? A difference in intelligence between races? Well, basically, I mean, if you look at statistics on the average IQ test scores of different ethnic groups, throughout the world, you find pretty often that there are differences in the average score, as well as obviously many individual differences. And in every case, including in the United States, where on average, there's a difference in the average scores of different ethnic groups within the United States. But I mean, you obviously that doesn't prove anything about genetics, and it's easy to point to differences in education and so on and so forth that could easily account for these differences. And certainly there's no evidence that genes that influence things like your skin pigmentation have anything to do with whatever genes, which we don't even know what they are, might influence intelligence. But anyway, so Wade publishes this book saying, certain groups are genetically inferior as far as intelligence, and not surprisingly, former Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard David Duke and other neo Nazis praised his book. Okay, so anyway, the point is, his claims about the Wuhan lab leak theory have about as much scientific basis as his racist claims about intelligence. Um, One thing that Wade made a big deal out of was that, um, you know, first of all, while there's a virology lab in Wuhan, you know, gee, that must be the reason why COVID started in Wuhan. But I mean, Wuhan is also home not only to a virology lab, but as we've talked about, all these animal markets where we know for a fact, as close as we can get in scientific research to a fact, that uh, animal markets were where SARS started. In Guangzhou, I think it's called, in southeastern China, in 2002, 2003. Um, and one claim that Wade made, which a lot of other pushers of the lab leak theory have made, is, um, well, those people that say it came out of nature, the bat caves where lots of bats that harbor coronaviruses live are mainly in Yunnan province, which is hundreds of miles away from Wuhan. Um, so Christian Anderson, one of the scientists who co-authored the papers I'm going to talk about, um, pointed out this is a really stupid argument. Um, because we know for a fact that the SARS virus came out of bats living in caves in Yunnan province in southwestern China, which is hundreds of miles away from the place where SARS broke out in Guangzhou and Hong Kong and so forth. How did it get there? Well, it didn't come directly from bats. What happened was that animals, wild animals living in that area who are trapped and sold for meat or fur or so forth were infected by bats. And so then those animals were brought to these animal markets in the cities where SARS broke out and sold there. And, that's how it happened. So Anderson's point is that Yunnan province is not any closer really to where SARS broke out than it is to where SARS-CoV-2 broke out, or where COVID broke out. They're both hundreds of miles away from where the bats mainly live. Incidentally, SARS also broke out in November of 2002, which is a time when people start coming indoors. The markets were, in fact, indoors in both Guangdong and Wuhan. And SARS-infected animals were found on several farms, not only in the Guangdong area, but also, as it turns out, in Hubei province, where Wuhan is located. Um, you know, so, and those animals, of course, are sold in markets in Wuhan, just like they are in markets in Guangdong. Another point that lab leak advocates like to bring up is that, well, they haven't found the hosts for, they haven't found the host animals yet. They were not able to find any evidence of COVID, of SARS-CoV-2 in the animals that they tested at Huanan or other markets, and they also have not yet been able to track down the original source of the virus, presumably in bat caves somewhere in either Western China or neighboring countries. But just going back to this article in Nature, where actually a team of researchers led by that very same woman who's been accused of Xi Jinping, who's been accused of being involved with leaking the coronavirus from the lab in Wuhan. She led the team of researchers that discovered the likely origin of SARS. And note the date of publication, 1st of December 2017. When did SARS originate? 2002. So it took 15 years. And they did find intermediate hosts, infected animals within the markets within a few months. But that was kind of a lucky accident because that time China didn't shut down any wet markets. And also, it should be pointed out, there are viruses which we have a lot of evidence originated zoonotically, such as the Ebola virus, where we don't know definitively what animals they originated with when they jumped into humans. We don't know that for Ebola still today, 50 years later. So, not only did the lab leak theory go from being kind of a right-wing promoted theory to being a theory that was pushed by the media and politicians in general, but also quite a few more conspiracy-minded people on the left, or people who label themselves independent journalists, have also been pushing it. So, for example, Jimmy Dore. I'm blocked by him, so this isn't going to come up. Shoot. Darn it. Okay, forget this. Unless I have it somewhere easily accessible. Sorry. So Jimmy's going on about how supposedly the Washington Post lied when they said that the Wuhan lab leak was a conspiracy theory that has been debunked. Um, yeah. And ironically, he says, fact check. Paulette Fact is nothing more than corporate approved propaganda funded by the Koch brothers and Washington Post. Well, you know, Jimmy, the people who minimize COVID and bash vaccines, who you basically take the same position as. In fact, you've interviewed uh, authors of the Great Barrington Declaration on your show. They're associated with Institute, uh, you know, uh, Barrington Institute, I guess it's called. That's funded by Koch. It's not the Koch brothers now because all but one of them's dead. But anyway, um, so Jimmy Dore's been pushing this lab leak theory. Uh, Ryan Grimm of Rising and the DC bureau chief at The Intercept is pushing it. Um, as are other people on the show Rising. Jimmy Dore has done tons of segments on it. Oh, Jon Stewart is another left-leaning person who's been promoting the lab leak theory or has done so. Um, anyway, um, bottom line on these people, like Nicholas Wade, they don't know a whole lot of science. They're not familiar with the details of research on this issue. Um, it was pretty obvious to me when I watched Ryan Grimm's segment on Rising, and when I um, read over his tweet thread, that he hadn't actually read the papers he was talking about. He just read some news articles about it. Um, and so basically, just like with Mike Pompeo or Donald Trump or whoever, people pushing this view, you know, just speculate about what ifs rather than talk about evidence, and they engage in ad hominem attacks on scientists such as Christian Anderson, who, as I mentioned, you know, is one of the co-authors of these two and a lot of other papers about the origins of the pandemic, attacks on the Wuhan lab scientists, etc., and also attacks on what they label as the establishment, which basically they mean Democrats and associated media outlets like CNN and MSNBC and so forth. And they don't really talk about all the right wingers who were far right wingers who happen to agree with him about the lab leak theory. Um, I wrote about this pattern recently. Sorry, this is the wrong um, article. So I said about Jimmy, who's a big promoter of the idea that lockdowns didn't make any difference, and so I wrote an article here showing why he's full of shit. Um, but anyway, I said that Jimmy's political analysis is very shallow. He his gut reactions are often on the mark, but it's not really uh, political analysis based on uh, critical thinking and in-depth investigation. It's just sort of knee-jerk anti-quote unquote establishment, um, which can lead you down the right path if you know everybody in the political establishment, the ruling class, is on the same page, promoting the same myths as they were when they said Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, or uh, Bashar al-Assad is an evil dictator and we've got to overthrow him, or whatever. But what if they're not? Um, you know, is one right and the other wrong? Or are they both wrong? Um, you know, uh, just being a knee-jerk, quote-unquote, anti-establishment uh, person doesn't get you anywhere. You know, it doesn't you know lead to in-depth analysis about vaccine efficacy or the efficacy of lockdowns or masks, or in this case, where COVID came from. Just doesn't help you with that. Um, yeah, and one thing that Door doesn't take note of, um, but you'll see if you look at mainstream outlets like the Washington Post and the New York Times, that they even though they may not have a diversity of viewpoints on, say, the war in Ukraine, or back when the war in Iraq, they do have a diversity of viewpoints about issues like where COVID came from. So, for example, some of the scientists who publish the papers I'm going to be talking about have published um, columns in the Washington Post. Angela Rasmussen and others. And folks actually asked Ryan Grimm if he had actually read the papers that he was referring to, and he never replied. Um, and it's pretty clear that he hasn't. Um, and he was asked, well, why don't you interview the scientists who did these papers that you're talking about? Why don't you have some of them on Rising and interview them, talk to them? But he didn't respond to that either, and I'm sure he never will. Cause none of these shows ever interview the scientists who they criticize. They don't give they don't give any indication from what they say that they've ever actually read uh, the uh, scientific research they're critiquing or promoting or whatever it is they're doing. And in general, uh, whatever their overall orientation is, believers in conspiracy theories seem to be motivated by this need to see themselves as special and unique and in the know. Um, R.A. Kruglansky, a social psychologist at the University of Maryland, has devoted much of his career to studying conspiracy theorists and what motivates them. Um, and he says one thing that often drives increasingly radicalized or extreme views, such as anti-vax views, which are discussed in this article, is what he calls the quest for significance, the human drive for dignity, respect, and purpose. Um, in my view, he says, it's the single most important social motivation. Um, you know, uh, basically, the idea is, hey, you know, I'm important. I've, looked behind the curtain and seen the truth. I'm in the know. Um, and, also, and there seems to be this sort of strong need for certainty and a desire for simple explanations, and kind of aversion to more nuanced and complex interpretations of reality. And the other thing he points out is that People travel in certain social networks where the vast majority of the people within their social networks share their point of view. Maybe not families, of course, but we tend to hang around with friends and make friends with people who agree with us on a lot of things. And so our beliefs about the world are reinforced in various ways by people around us. Not only do they agree with us, but they have the same. I mean, they express the same opinions as us, and they give us uh, new ideas and information that we tend to accept because we don't evaluate their opinions critically. And um, as I've talked about before on the show, when you hear something over and over, if your views are repeated over and over, or if any view is repeated over and over, just the mere repetition of it, social psychology studies have shown this, tends to make people believe that something is true. So nobody ever presented any evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, but it was repeated over and over and over and over again, and actually researchers call this the validity effect. That basically, they found in their research, controlled study manipulating how many times they repeated false things to people. The more they were repeated, the more people believed them. The validity effect, and that's what tends to happen. And I've got to say, there's a financial aspect of this too. Um, Someone compared the views that Jimmy Dore gets on his videos related to COVID, where he's minimizing it, calling it a cold or whatever, even though it's killed 1 million people in the United States, or he's minimizing the efficacy of vaccines, or he's pushing conspiracy theories like lab leak. Um, they get more views than his videos on other things, a lot more. So, there's a financial angle here too. Um, but in any case, let me get to talking about some evidence. First of all, let's talk about some evidence you know, during the last couple of years that's come out. Um, oh, there it is. First thing to note is that um, SARS-CoV-2 is just the ninth documented coronavirus that infects humans. The seventh that's been identified in the last 20 years. And every single coronavirus that infects humans up to this point in time uh, has been shown by the evidence to have zoonotic origins. In other words, they jumped from animals to humans. So the evidence is very clear that the virus that causes SARS spilled over into humans in Foshan and Guangdong province, and in Guangzhou, also in Guangdong province. And both of these jumps from animals to humans were associated with markets selling live animals and involving species such as civets and raccoon dogs that also happen to be sold live in Wuhan markets uh, back then, as well as in 2019, when the COVID pandemic began. And these same animals are known to be susceptible to SARS-CoV-2 infection. People who were selling animals in the markets in Guangdong province in 2003 even though they weren't diagnosed with SARS, they showed a lot of them showed antibodies to the SARS virus. Okay, I'll come back to what I've got the uh, screen focused on in a moment. Um, Viruses that are closer in important respects to um, SARS-CoV-2 than the virus that was known to be in the Wuhan lab, RATG13 is what it was called. Viruses closer than that to SARS-CoV-2 have been found uh, in research that was published last year. Um, okay, I forgot to mention you know, the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab did have a virus in their collection called RATG13, which is kind of a distant relative of SARS-CoV-2. It's also a coronavirus, um, and it has 96% similarity to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and it might sound like that's a lot, but you know humans and chimpanzees have more than 99% of their genes in common. Would you say that humans and chimpanzees aren't very different? So 96% is really, scientists say, decades of evolution away from producing the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Um, But it wasn't until 2021 that scientists discovered viruses that actually were closer to um, SARS-CoV-2 than the original virus. So they found these viruses in bat caves in Laos, um, and in the part of the virus critical to infecting humans called the receptor binding domain. These viruses turned out to be more similar to the original variant of SARS-CoV-2, the one that started the pandemic there in Wuhan, then that part of the virus is to variants of the virus that have emerged recently, including at the time this article was written, the Delta variant. Um, they're not closer across the board, but they're closer in terms of the part of the virus that's important for infecting humans. And uh, it should be pointed out that the original COVID virus it was not as good at infecting people as the ones that have come along since then. It was very contagious, no doubt about that. It was more contagious than the flu or colds by far, and definitely more likely to cause serious illness. But the ones that we have circulating around now are far more contagious than the original COVID virus. Um, so anyway, um, so these newly discovered viruses are significantly more effective, the researchers say, at infecting people than RATG13, which is not at all good at infecting people. Okay, well let's move along to um, another um, paper published last year about animal sales in the wet markets in Wuhan. And basically, in a nutshell, um, they documented, there's some photographs from the Huanan market. Um, this one right here. Oh, and these are other markets. Um, there were lots of wild animals being sold in the markets in Wuhan. And by the way, this is one way that I knew that Ryan Grimm hadn't read the articles he was talking about. He talked in his video segment about you know how um, the lab leak theory wasn't any more racist than saying that Chinese people ate bats, like the people who say it came from animals claim. Well, nobody's saying that people were directly infected by bats or that bats were sold in uh, markets in Wuhan. If he knew a damn thing about any of this, he would know that, but he doesn't. Um, okay, so this is a list of animals that were found to be sold in Wuhan markets between 2017 and November 2019 when the pandemic broke out. And quite a few of them, such as raccoon dogs, for example, and mass palm civets, are known to be carriers of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And they were on sale right when the pandemic began. Now I mentioned earlier they weren't, but they didn't find any animals that tested positive in the Wuhan market. Well, one possible reason for that is that the animals which this researcher documented were being sold in Huanan and three other markets right at the time of the pandemic started. That you know vendors had presumably gotten word that the government was on the lookout for animals infected with COVID, with SARS-CoV-2, and so uh, those animals weren't there. Um, the vendors who sold potentially infectious and also illegal animals, you know, uh, took those animals out of their market. And the market was actually closed on January 1st, 2020, and at that point they tested the animals that were there. But you can get a long prison term for selling animals illegally. They just don't necessarily do the greatest job of enforcing the rules. Um, okay, just a couple more pieces of evidence from previously. Um, two of the three documented cases of COVID, and 33% of all cases, two of the first three documented cases of COVID, and 33%, 55 out of 168, of all cases of COVID documented through December of 2019 were directly linked to the Hunan market. They were either workers at the market or they were people who, when they interviewed them, they found out they had shopped at the Huanan market. Um, and 55% of those cases that were identified in 2019, you had some sort of link to at least one of the four markets in question, particularly in the first half of December. There were also environmental samples taken into market that showed a lot of SARS-CoV-2 positive samples, and those samples were particularly likely to be found in parts of the market where animals known to be carriers of SARS-CoV-2 had been sold. Um, and I mentioned earlier, no workers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology or the Wuhan branch of the Chinese Centers for Disease Control, none of them tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. So again, if you want to be a conspiracy theorist and assume that Chinese scientists must be lying about that, well, being a China basher is your thing, but it's not mine. Okay, actually, as far as these two recent papers published in Science just a week ago. Uh, the first one that I wanted to talk about, and it's really complicated and you know goes into some biology that you probably don't understand any better than I do. But the basic point is that they showed through methods for basically dating how long different viruses have been around. Um, that they were able to establish that at least two separate spillover events of SARS-CoV-2, which involved the two different lineages of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that were around at that time, lineage A and lineage B, uh, occurred in the Huanan market, roughly a week apart, because they found both of these lineages in people who had been to or worked at the Huanan markets, and they were able to you know, figure out approximately when they had been infected. So they say the most probable explanation for the introduction of SARS-CoV-2 into humans involves zoonotic jumps from as yet undetermined intermediate host animals at the Huanan market. Through late 2019, the Huanan market, Huanan seafood market, sold animals that are known to be susceptible to SARS-CoV-2 infection and capable of intraspecies transmission. And I'm not sure if they mean that or interspecies transmission, because obviously they're capable of both. The presence of potential animal reservoirs, coupled with the timing of the lineage B primary case and the geographic clustering of early cases around the Huanan market, support the hypothesis SARS-CoV-2 lineage B jumped into humans at the Huanan market in mid-November 2019. And then, about a week later, lineage A, they say, jumped, like in late November 2019. And both lineage A and lineage B have been confirmed to be linked with people who worked at or visited the Huanan market. Okay, let's look at the primary paper that people have been talking about. The Huanan seafood wholesale market in Wuhan was the early epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so they say, we show that the earliest known COVID-19 cases from December 2019, including those without reported direct links to the market, were geographically centered on this market. We report that live SARS-CoV-2 susceptible mammals were sold at the market in late 2019, and within the market, SARS-CoV-2 positive environmental samples were spatially associated with vendors selling live mammals. While there's insufficient evidence to define upstream events and exact circumstances remain obscure, our analyses indicate that the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 occurred via the live wildlife trade in China and show that the Huanan market was the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so how do they know that? Let's talk about some of the details of what they found out. So one thing they discovered was that out of 41 people who were hospitalized with what at that time was some unknown form of pneumonia. They hadn't definitively identified this as one new disease yet. By January 2nd, 2020, out of 41 hospitalized with an unknown form of pneumonia, 66%, had direct exposure to the Huanan wholesale seafood market. And also, 55 out of 168 total known cases of this pneumonia, which we now know is COVID, uh, also had exposure to the market. So there's a line in their introduction here that people have made who buy into the lab leak theory have made a big deal of. They say the observation that the preponderance of early cases were linked to the Huanan market does not establish that the pandemic originated there. Oh, there it is. Okay. Now, bear in mind, this is in the introduction to their paper. There's the abstract and then the introduction, which typically in scientific journal articles isn't labeled introduction. It's just the start of the paper. So they're setting up their study. They're not saying what they found. They're saying, well, up to this point, it's been observed that the preponderance of early cases were linked to the Huanan market. That's very suggestive evidence. However, it isn't good enough to establish that the pandemic originated there. And so what we're going to do in our study is show you further evidence that supports that claim. So they're not saying, oh, we still don't know. They're saying, we've got pretty good evidence and we're going to talk about it. So, based on information from the World Health Organization's report on the initial outbreak in Wuhan, issued in February 2021, the researchers who published this paper were able to locate where 155 of the initial 2019 cases lived. That's way better than the evidence that we have here in the United States about early cases of COVID, because basically the United States didn't even test anybody until March, and the first cases diagnosed through symptoms rather than tests were in late January, and then there were cases in February, there were deaths in February, but nobody was getting tested in the United States. Meanwhile, China developed a test for COVID very early on, and not only that, but they kept records of where people lived that they made accessible to the World Health Organization. So anyway, so basically one of their objectives was to determine where the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic in its early stages in 2019 was. So they say, in this study we obtained data from a range of sources to test the hypothesis that the COVID-19 pandemic began at the Huanan market, which is what people thought all along. So Chinese officials closed down the Huanan market as soon as they figured out what was going on in early January of 2020. Okay, so as I said, they found exactly where 155 documented early cases of COVID-19 lived, and although there were cases throughout Wuhan, the vast majority clustered in central Wuhan, near the west bank of the Yangtze River, which is where the Huanan market is. They say, we used a kernel density estimate to reconstruct an underlying probability density function from which the home locations for each case were drawn. And they say the highest density of cases was right around the Huanan market. And the clustering of COVID-19 cases in December around the Huanan market is in marked contrast to the pattern of cases in January through February, where they were dispersed all over the city and, in fact, of course, all over the world. Um, let's see, okay, here we go. Um, so this is a map of where the early cases of COVID were, the ones that took place in 2019. So, there are cases in a lot of parts of uh, uh, Wuhan, but they're very, very clustered right around the Huanan market, which is right there in the bigger picture, right there. So, what they found was that, first of all, on average, the cases that were not linked to the market lived less than a kilometer. So, like, in American terms, less than 3,000 feet from the Huanan market. Um, that seems pretty remarkable. Okay, well, how would that happen? Basically, uh, like people who were infected with COVID, either worked or shopped at the Huanan market, and either they lived close by or they went to restaurants in the neighborhood or things like that, and spread it around in the immediate vicinity of the Huanan market. Um, that's the most likely scenario. Um, and they found that the average distance of cases that were linked to the market was 2.28 kilometers from the market. So, in other words, about a mile and a half away from the market. So, half of the cases were in people who live farther away than 2.28 kilometers, and half of them were in people who live closer to the market than 2.28 kilometers. Um, and if you just if you plot out, where the exact center of the cases you know, is basically right there at the Huanan market. Um, dead center. Like if you were playing a game of darts, and the bullseye was the Huanan market. Um, you know, uh, if you were good at darts, uh, you basically would replicate the pattern that they found. And they calculated the probability of this occurring just by chance. Uh, the probability that you would observe a case density for cases in November and December 2019 in the area surrounding the Huanan market, which was much denser than the number of cases in equivalently sized geographic regions anywhere else in Wuhan. They calculated that there was a probability of less than 1 in 100,000 that you would have seen that pattern just by accident. No other area of Wuhan had anywhere close to the case density that that area had. Okay, yeah, there it is. By the way, I'll put the links to these papers and other articles or papers I've talked about in the video description. Um, okay, as we already talked about, both early lineages of SARS-CoV-2 were geographically associated with the market. So, uh, the center point of the 11 lineage B cases that they tracked down from December and had location information for was 1.95 kilometers from the Huanan market, not very far. Um, and similarly for lineage A cases. I already mentioned 7 species that are susceptible to SARS-CoV-2 infection were documented to have been sold at the market in November of 2019 and prior to that. Now, one thing that people like Ryan Grimm have argued was, yeah, they show that there were a lot of cases associated with the Huanan market. Yeah, but so what they've shown is just this is a super spreader event. Lots of people got infected with COVID who had some connection to the market. Um, but no, Ryan, you didn't read the paper because if you had, you'd know that this was more than just a super spreader event. Um, you know, because what these researchers did to rule out that possibility was that they looked at social media data on how frequently people visited different locations in Wuhan, like shopping malls and restaurants and museums and so on and so forth. Um, and what they found is that there were more than 400 places in Wuhan, um, shopping malls and supermarkets and other stores, schools, hospitals, etc. Um, that had more visitors, who checked in on social media um, than the Huanan market. Here's how many visitors there were at Huanan market. Um, and here's the most visited place. I'm not sure what that is, but you can see here. People go to lots of places far more often than they go to the Huanan market. The location of the uh, biggest initial outbreak of COVID. Furthermore, positive environmental samples were linked both to live mammal sales and to human cases at the Wuhan market. So they were able to find out where in the market people had visited. Of course, they knew where in the market different sorts of animals were being sold, and where in the market positive environmental samples, such as from cages or other paraphernalia associated with selling live animals. Um, and overwhelmingly, environmental samples of SARS-CoV-2 uh, were associated with the booths that had been illegally selling wild animals capable of transmitting SARS-CoV-2. Um, they also found that when antibody tests were done in Wuhan, um, you know, the people who were most likely to test positive were those who lived in neighborhoods near the Wuhan market. All right, so just to kind of summarize things, um, there's an abundance of evidence consistent with Huanan market being the primary origin of the virus, and some other markets to a significant extent are also being early origins of the cases of the virus documented in November and December. Um, there's no evidence consistent with it being a lab leak. You know, we don't have any record of anybody in the virology labs, testing positive for antibodies for COVID early on, and they say they did test them all. And if you choose not to believe them when they say that, well, that's your choice. But you know, um, you know just speculating that somebody is not telling the truth is not evidence. Um, and, again, this is consistent with what's known even more definitively about the origin of SARS in 2002, where they actually tracked down animals that were positive for COVID, that were had been sold in or were being sold in the markets in Southeast China. Um, and it's consistent with what we know about the origins of epidemics and pandemics generally. That overwhelmingly, it's when viruses spill over from animals to humans. That's how the other super bad pandemic in history, the 1918 to 1920 flu pandemic, originated. I believe it originated with chickens. And, again, if you want to still say, in spite of all the evidence that's come out, and in spite of what Chinese scientists themselves have said with respect to there not being any evidence connecting it with their labs, you're necessarily accusing these scientists of being liars. You're playing into Cold War propaganda. And, I guess that's kind of what you'd expect from, pseudo-leftist China bashers like Ryan Grimm, or if you're a leftist who's prone to subscribing to conspiracy theories because it makes you feel cool and with it to believe in them, and you hear people in your social circle repeat them over and over. But if you're a socialist who takes a scientific approach to the world, you should be basing your opinions on evidence, or you will be if you're a socialist who take a scientific approach to the world. And at this point, the evidence points overwhelmingly toward the conclusion that this virus, like every other coronavirus before it that's infected humans, burst onto the scene and caused an epidemic, in this case a pandemic, because of animal spillover. Probably more than one spillover, according to the research that the other recent science paper presented. Like other conspiracy theories, the lab leak theory requires the assumption that a successful cover-up involving a very large number of people who know but haven't squealed even after years, which seems really unlikely, and just ignoring the fact that there's literally zero evidence for a lab leak, and there's an ever-growing pile of evidence favoring Huanan market as the main origin. But even setting aside what the evidence suggests, if you believe that a huge number of people is going to keep a very embarrassing secret for years, nobody's going to have any motivation to come out with it, to leak it. That on its face doesn't seem very plausible. But then, of course, there's all this evidence. Now, people like Ryan Grimm or others who promote the lab leak theory say there's nothing racist or China bashing about lab leak theory, because believing that it emerged from animal markets is not any less prone to motivating people to have racist stereotypes of Chinese people. That COVID emerging from a market would mean that those disgusting Chinese people eat bats or something. But again, Chinese people don't, as far as I know, eat bats. Extremely few of them anyway. And there were no bats at the Wuhan market. Which, if you knew anything about the pandemic, Ryan, you would know that. Now, it's true that the fact that some Chinese people eat dogs promotes racist stereotypes about, those disgusting, cruel Chinese or whatever. But of course, that ignores what American factory farms do to cows and pigs and chickens, or, for that matter, the fact that there's also wet markets in cities in the United States that could very easily launch some sort of virus into the human population and create an epidemic. But on the other hand, believing that SARS-CoV-2 emerged from animal markets in Wuhan doesn't require anything other than believing that China has a problem with enforcing its laws about illegal sales of wild animals, especially those susceptible to diseases like the ones caused by coronaviruses, which, you know, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but there's a strong link between coronaviruses and bats living in caves in parts of China and neighboring countries. Um, China, like everywhere else in the world, has a problem with encroaching on forests and other wild animal habitat due to development and industries like forestry and mining, animal agriculture, which is the world's leading destroyer of forests, um, and you know this in China's case, you know, animal agriculture involves breeding animals that potentially can carry coronaviruses. Um, but one thing that it doesn't require, even though obviously it's problematic that China, like other places in the world, is destroying habitat through various industries, including particularly animal agriculture, and being careless with not enforcing laws about illegal sales of wild animals that can carry diseases. But it doesn't require you to believe that anybody's lying. It doesn't require you to believe that Chinese government officials or scientists are sneaky liars, despite there being no evidence that they're covering anything up. And on the other hand, an abundance of evidence that the emergence of COVID happened exactly how they have been saying it did for 2.5 years, and which led them to immediately close the Huanan market. And believing that, despite evidence against it, that does seem racist to me. You're saying people are lying without any evidence. And, this also doesn't give credit to China for its really remarkably successful effort to control COVID, which from the very beginning has been guided by a scientific approach, an approach guided by facts on the ground, including the fact that it, with very high likelihood, originated in animal markets, which the Chinese government closed down as soon as they figured out what was happening. Okay, and certainly more evidence will emerge about the origins of COVID. I don't expect that they'll find. Well, there's no way they're going to find animals that were originally infected with COVID that were sold in the markets because they're nowhere to be found. But probably they will find more viruses out in the wild. They're in southwestern China and places close to it that carry viruses closely related to SARS-CoV-2. So there's more evidence to come, but at this point, the evidence certainly suggests that SARS-CoV-2's origins are much like the origins of other viruses that have led to pandemics. Okay, thanks for listening. I will talk to you next time.